Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the 31st session of Islamicate Book Reviews with myself, al-Azami, and my weekly sort of discussant and interlocutor who is going to be presenting the book for this week, Dr. Omar Anchassi, sort of broadcasting in from Riyadh in Saudi, and affiliated with two institutions, the University of Exeter and the King Faisal Centre for Islamic Research. So it gives us great pleasure to welcome you from whichever parts of the world you may be sort of connecting. Ironically, Omar, we are sort of connecting on a day where the weather in the UK and Saudi Arabia is remarkably similar. I believe we have temperatures nearing 39 degrees today in the UK. Where I am exactly in Leicester, it is actually currently only 36 degrees. I say only with scare quotes. And I assume this would be considered mild by your standards, Omar.
After sunset, it's in the high 30s to mid 30s these days. So
right,
probably similar.
So weather aside, which will allow viewers to forgive my attire, this week's book is a book which, from a scholar whom both Omar and I know and admire, whose work we admire a good deal, Marion Katz, and her latest work, after a string of works that she's written, very prolific author, mashallah, entitled Wives and Work, the subtitle being Islamic Law and Ethics Before Modernity. Although in characteristic style in relation to her previous works, she does have a kind of concluding section that engages modernity as well. So Omar, the format is going to be as per usual. Omar, you can present the sort of an overview of the book in 10 to 15 minutes as you find suitable. If you want to go longer than that, you're welcome to be my guest, and then I will engage you in a discussion about the book. This is Marion's work is very interesting to me, and I made an effort to have a read of this book this week, but unlike yourself, I don't read the footnotes quite so carefully, so I've read the core body of the text, but have flicked in and out of the footnotes. And so after that, we're also welcoming people to put in their questions in the chat. You can do this on YouTube in the chat box, I think, and Facebook as well. And those two will come to us, and we will try and engage them in the latter half of the presentation. So without further ado, Omar, I'd like to hand it over to you to give a presentation on this week's book.
Thanks, Osama. And this week's book is, as I often say, an interesting one, which isn't a very revealing comment. But I do think it's one of great relevance to us as individuals and to the Muslim community, whether in the Western part of the world or more generally. Not, in fact, unlike her previous book, Women in the Mosque. There are, however, some key differences between this book and Katz's previous one. Her book on Women in the Mosque surveyed both legal doctrine and also made an attempt to gauge social practice and social history through a range of sources, everything from miniatures and manuscripts to the architecture of mosques, to travelogues by European visitors to the Muslim majority world. However, because of the nature of the sources here, it's far more difficult to gauge the extent to which women actually engaged in domestic labor or housework. These are terms used interchangeably, and the Arabic term largely used in the text she explores for these texts is khidmah. Of course, there's no agreed upon definition of these English terms either, but they're used for use of reference. And the nature of the sources, even those that are otherwise very rich in providing historians with insights into social history, such as the Cairo Geniza and the diary of the famous Mamluk era notary Ibn Tawq, these don't actually comment on women's domestic labor very much. And because of the focus of the work is on pre-Ottoman fiqh doctrine, and in the prior to the Ottoman period, court records are also somewhat scant. So the focus of the work is really on legal doctrine to a great extent. But one of the key emphasis of Katz is that jurists were more than simply jurists, and nor did fiqh and fiqh norms monopolize the discussion of women's domestic and household labor. In fact, she points to a series of, somewhat autonomous, largely overlapping, and for the most part complementary series of moral or normative frameworks drawn on the ethnographic literature. Authors, anthropologists, like ethnographers speak of moral registers and systems of value. So the doctrines of the legal schools are only one part of the discussion, and in no sense do they exhaust the discussion of marriage and marital norms, particularly as it pertains to domestic labor, which is the focus of this excellent monograph. I should say about Marion Katz, she's really one of the pillars of the discipline of Islamic studies generally. Most of her contributions really pertain to the study of Islamic law, particularly as it relates to things like gender and also ritual, beginning with her first work in 2002, which I believe was based on her Chicago PhD thesis, body of text, which really looks at the law of purity among Sunnis and in Sunni works of law. That was the first work of hers I read in my early years as a graduate student. And it's a most impressive work. And also, of course, the book previously mentioned, Women in the Mosque, and her book on prayer in Islamic thought and practice, which Usama we've, I think, alluded to multiple times in our discussions privately, and I think even in the series of broadcasts. The one book of hers, unfortunately, I haven't yet read, is the one on Mawlid. So I do have to make time for that sooner or later. And when reading Marion Katz's work, of course, many, many important papers and even actually some significant online writings that I'm going to have to gesture to because they're relevant when discussing this book. When thinking of the work of Marion Katz, I'm reminded of a Canadian friend of mine who introduced me to the phrase. He was a great fan of basketball. He described a player as a clutch player. Sam, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this phraseology. It seems to be distinctly North American. A clutch player in basketball or presumably any other competitive sport is someone who consistently performs outstandingly, and their performance never they never have a bad day. I mean, at least as far as the published product of Dr. Katz's labor, I think reflects this phrase very nicely. And I've often thought to myself that when I grow up, this is the kind of author I aspire to write like. So, and occasionally I am in a position to recommend or to suggest titles that should be translated into Arabic. I have friends who work with publishers and have relationships with them. Copyright issues notwithstanding, because I'm not involved in that side of the operation. Katz's books all deserve translation into Arabic. I haven't seen any Arabic translations yet, but hopefully these will be commissioned at some point with author's permission, ideally. Anyway, so that's very briefly about the author's work, and I've said something about the scope of the book, which is divided into an introduction, conclusion, and 4 body chapters. The introduction and 4 body chapters are around the same length, give or take about 40 pages each. The conclusion is slightly less than 20. And then you have footnotes appearing as endnotes, not on the main body of the text. Now, she draws on the work of many previous scholars, particularly figures like Isha Ali and Karen Bauer, and I'll unpack that more. We've agreed with Sam, I believe today will be a longer episode of up to 2 hours, perhaps even more, reflecting the importance and pertinence of this work and the scope of its contribution to this extremely important and personally relevant subject. I mean, statistically, most people here, most of our viewers and listeners will at some point marry, whether they're male or female, and most of them will also have children. And most of them, I guess, are Muslim as well. And that's true for non-Muslims in any case. So it's commonly assumed, Katz tells us that Islamic law, at least in its classical iteration, exempts wives from the obligation to provide domestic labor. And the book nuances this fairly simple claim and complicates it. Although, generally speaking, on the face of it, at least until the end of the 5th century, this was largely true. Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, who died in 321, said, if I remember rightly, the jurists basically agreed that a wife is not obligated to serve herself. And Ibn al-Mundhir said that the scope of who dies in 318, I believe, said that the scope of the juristic difference of opinion or khilaf largely revolves around the nature of service the husband is obligated to provide his wife, and how many servants, and so on. And now, of course, it's not the whole story, but it seems in the early period, the majority opinion or Jumhur view was indeed that wives are not obligated to provide their husbands with domestic labor. This is a view that is basically attributed to all of the eponyms of the 4 Sunni madahib. And Ibn Qudama even says there is a nas or explicit text from Ahmed to this effect, although Katz is unable to trace it, in the Masail works of Ahmed. It's just something that Ibn Qudama, who has access to many more of these Masail works than we currently do, is aware of. There are exceptions, however, even in this early period and among the Fuqaha al-Amsar before the emergence of the classical schools, such as Abu Thawr, who dies in 240, a disciple of Shafi, who nonetheless is associated with his own distinct juristic school. Al-Juzajani, who dies circa 259. And others indeed as well see in the 3rd century, including those affiliated with the school of Malik. Anyway, the structure of the book, as I said, 4 body chapters. And again, the approach is somewhat different to Katz's most recent book, where the discussion is conveniently divided into discrete chapters on legal practice, social reality, then a very interesting and involved discussion of a treatise by a jurist who, still in manuscript, whose name currently escapes me, who argues effectively that women should not be barred from the haram in response to a particular decree issued by the authorities in his day, and then a chapter on developments in the modern period. As I say, because of the nature of the sources, Katz is not able to offer a sustained treatment of social reality and social history, and she is instead brackets this and says that, like Isha Ali in her outstanding Marriage and Slavery, is really interested in reconstructing the jurist's sort of conceptual world, as opposed to how this kind of may have functioned in reality. Of course, as she points out, jurists were not hermetically sealed from that social world, nor indeed from the norms and discussions of commoners. In any case, kind of riffing off this wonderful blog post Dr. Katz made for, I should call her Marion, I guess, since both of us know her. She wrote, I want to focus on 2 very interesting blog posts that will be of relevance for the Harvard Islamic Law blog. One discussing at length the Hadith Fatima, which I will return to, and the second, which I will discuss briefly here, on the neglected study of furu'. Furu' texts are intimidatingly massive in size, unlike works of Usul. I mean, Sarakhsi's Mabsut in one edition is 30 volumes, for example, or so. And this has often prevented, or at least hindered, scholars from engaging with furu' texts and all of their length and richness and complexity. And Katz says, or suggests, that there are really two approaches to the study of furu', drawing on the terminology of, I believe, geology, the transverse, what is it, the, Ross? Transverse, is it the, I mean, her terms essentially correspond, transverse slice, and my memory is terrible. In any case, largely correspond to the distinction between diachronic and synchronic studies. So those focusing on...
It up, and she says transverse slice and core sample.
Yes, fantastic. So core sample, basically long diachronic stretch of time, exploring doctrinal shifts in the kind of long durée, if you like, which is an approach exemplified in her most recent book prior to this one, where she tracks the development of legal doctrine, essentially concludes, if I can be so bold as to simplify, that jurists became more conservative over time as far as women's mobility and mosque access was concerned. Not, of course, a development that went entirely uncontested. She does have an excellent paper in the very obscure journal, I believe, the Cardozo Law School Review or something, on the notion of fasad al-zaman, that is, of course, of relevance. In any case, the transverse slice, by contrast, focuses on a particular period and reading a whole array of materials from that period to kind of enrich one's understanding of a particular source. Now, her most recent prior book, as I said, is probably best characterized as, although it is, of course, very involved analytically and reads text carefully, it's closer to the core sample approach, long durée, you know, not unlike Sadeghi's book. Whereas this book, although there is some an element, you know, a concern with the development of legal doctrine, reflects much more closely the notion of a transverse slice. Why? Because in each of the body chapters, she focuses on an outstanding, or in some cases more than one outstanding exemplary school jurist. The first chapter being somewhat of an exception, because she does look at Sahnun in his Mudawana, dies 240, as well as Zuhd. And she tracks the development of early Maliki opinion roughly from the Mudawana of Sahnun, who's in dialogue with Ibn al-Qasim, student of Malik, until Ibn Khuwaizman dad, who dies sometime in the late 4th century. I believe that the Dhahabi gives his death date as 390. So she kind of tracks the development of school doctrine. And in a later chapter on Ibn Qudama and Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, the final body chapter of the work, she then resumes the story of Maliki doctrinal development by discussing the view of Sidi Khalil in his Mukhtasar, who represents a departure, a kind of distinct doctrinal shift from this formative period. In the second body chapter, she looks at Mawardi, who dies in 1058, 480, if I'm not mistaken, of the Hijrah.
450. The same birthday of Ghazali, so 1058, 450.
Yeah. And that's also very interesting. And she focuses, in terms of Mawardi, on his massive Al-Hawi, Al-Kabir, which is ultimately a commentary on Muzani's Mukhtasar, and also his work of ethics or akhlaq, adab al-dunya wa din. The third chapter, or the third body chapter rather, looks at the Hanafi jurist Sarakhsi, late 5th century, 480, I want to say, but my memory for dates is not always great. and focusing, while exploring the development of early Hanafi doctrine, going, up to Ibn Mazar, who dies in 616, who is, related distantly through marriage, I believe, to Sarakhsi. The focus is largely on Sarakhsi and his Mabsut. And the final body is a chapter, as I said, looking at Ibn Qudamah to some extent, but largely discussing Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, who builds on the work of his Sheikh. And then there's a chapter on modern development, sorry, so I may have miscounted. And is that distinct from the no? The conclusion is a discussion of modern developments.
The conclusion is developments, yeah.
Correct. And that looks at a range of views, as well as the overall discursive shift, blending to an unprecedented degree and reflecting the popularity of Ibn Taymiyyah, law and ethics. A very important distinction in this work, as found in the subtitle, and the increasing emphasis on wives' domesticity and the obligation of their domestic labor, as reflected in the views of such modern jurists as Muhammad Mukhtar al-Shinqiti, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Ibn Jibreen, the Saudi jurist. And there's also an interesting discussion of Rashid Rida and Ibn Uthaymeen, of course, a Hanbali who ultimately supports views unlike Ibn Taymiyyah, which I will return to discussing. So that hopefully gives a broad overview of the work without actually saying much about content. Again, the emphasis in this work is on multiple, largely complementary, but often somewhat intention as well, normative frameworks, or you could say moral registers, and these kind of tensions even figure in strictly fiqhi texts like Sarakhsi's Mabsut, which is an outstanding example of some of these tensions, because Sarakhsi's view, unprecedented in the Hanafi school, is that wives are not legally, hukman, obligated to perform domestic labor, but they are ethico-religiously, tadayyunan, obligated to do so. Diyanatan or tadayyunan is also used, if I'm not mistaken. And she does refer to Junaid Qadri, on whom we had a previous episode, and of course the work of Rushayn Abbazi to explore this distinction. And importantly, the work of Baba Johansson, who, through his explorations of Sarakhsi and Kasani, has emphasized this distinction within the fiqh itself between a kind of worldly domain associated with qada and an otherworldly, between man and his God, if you like, domain more associated with fatwa, dunya versus deen, qada versus ifta, zahir versus batin, and and so on. This very important distinction, as I said, reflected in the subtitle. Now, there are kind of Katz in the introductory chapter describes kind of four key moral frameworks or normative systems, if you like, only one of which is fiqh. Then additionally, you have zuhd, which she translates as this kind of renunciant discourse. She refers to, I think, 4 or 5 of Melchit's article, but not his book, Before Sufism, which is a shame because it actually really emphasizes the point she tries to make, drawing partly on Karen Bauer, of how doctrine shifted or was pressured to shift as a result of Muslims' changed status from being a small conquest elite to being, a stratified mass society. We mentioned in the previous episode Jack Tanus's citation of Patricia Kroner's kind of rough and ready statistic that when Muslims went out into the world to kind of conquer the late ancient Near East and surrounding bits of the Mediterranean world, they were no more than 500,000 persons in the first Islamic century, ruling over between 20 and 30 million. So no more than 5% of the population. What is Melchit's main argument in his book, Before Sufism? Essentially that this renunciant piety was an attempt to sustain the forms of piety maintained by this conquest elite. Now, this has all kinds of implications also for wives' domestic labor, because in these early texts, the ubiquity of basically slave labor is assumed. And if you read early historical reports, the kind of leading companions may have had dozens of slaves. I do have one suggestion, perhaps, with the book. And to some extent, I understand this is a reflection of the use of the term khidma, which is somewhat ambiguous, but Katz nowhere seems to properly distinguish, servitude generally from slavery. And in some places she speaks of enslaved servants, which doesn't really make sense to me, because in English we're accustomed to, assume that servants are, at least this is my general impression, servants are kind of paid versus slaves who are not paid for their labor. Right. I would have liked to see even just a paragraph of reflection on this. I don't recall seeing anything, but you find this kind of.
Yeah, I seem to recall her at one point sort of making a distinction between slaves and a servant who would be paid, but she was doing it, I think, in the chapter about modern.
Yeah, so for example, she mentions Yossi Rappaport's discussion in Marriage, Money, and Divorce, another outstanding book she draws on quite heavily, especially for the discussion of Ibn Taymiyyah, that, for instance, in Rappaport's, the sources Rappaport looks at, there's basically no reference to paid domestic servants. But I think a more systematic elaboration of this would have been, and again, I understand, it reflects the fact that jurists themselves may not have, in fact, don't seem to have made this distinction. It doesn't really matter from a jurist's perspective if the service a wife, khidma, a wife is provided, comes from a slave or a paid domestic servant. But, from a historical point, I think it's just interesting and perhaps, worth just a few sentences on. In any case, so fiqh is one of these norms, zuhd, as I said, this early renunciant discourse, to which to a very to some extent at least, khidmah, it presents a moral hazard. She refers to a number of works, especially the Ihya of al-Ghazali and Sulami's Tabaqat al-Sufiyya. He dies in 421, and interestingly, because part of that Tabaqat work is devoted to women, it's been translated by Ruqayya Cornell, and the phrase khidma appears disproportionately in the context of female Sufis' lives. Of course, Sulami kind of conflates all early ascetics and mystics with Sufis. This kind of he projects this onto them in the past. But anyway, it's something that Katz mentions. Proportionally speaking, the term khidma appears 7 times more frequently in the biographies of female Sufis than male ones, which is interesting, mostly associated with typical domestic chores and drudgery. And in many contexts, including the Kitab al-Zuhd of Waqi' ibn al-Jarrah, dies 197, and Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak's Kitab al-Zuhd dies 181, the Sirat Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, and so on. Many of these early figures are said to have symbolically renounced benefiting from the labor of others. Katz, with her keenly skeptical eye, insightfully observes that this was more honored than the breach, and this renunciation of others' labor was intermittent, symbolically done to kind of cultivate humility, but most of the time they didn't actually dispense with the labor of slaves or wives. In these early sources, again, this labor is assumed to come largely from women. It's highly gendered. So, for example, Al-Hasan al-Basri says he knew of some people whom out of wara did not ask their wives to serve them. However, Katz says in practice they probably did serve them most of the time. Piety is all well and good, but ultimately someone has to take out the trash, especially in an era before labor-saving devices like washing machines. And even the baking of bread is, nobody, at least in the economically developed world, really grinds their own grain to prepare bread. And the baking of bread is now a sort of fun hobby thing rather than something anyone does for a living. I've spoken for much longer than I should have discussing much of this. But perhaps we can refer to that, Usama. You can prompt me where necessary to discuss the substance of each of the chapters. Anyway, I should mention the last two kinds of moral frameworks, normative frameworks, before we proceed. So I mentioned fiqh, I mentioned zuhd, and which is kind of later absorbed into Sufism ultimately. And the remaining frameworks are akhlaq, or ethics, if you like, which is strongly associated with this Greek tradition of what's called practical philosophy. You know, for the Greeks, practical philosophy was divided into, at least as this kind of reached Islamic intellectual tradition, you know, ethics, domestic economy, as it used to be called, and political economy. Domestic economy, also called household management or tadbir al-manzil, exemplified by this first century treatise of the bizarre author, probably writing under a pen name, Sir Simon Swain Bryson, spelled like Bill Bryson with a Y. And this was translated into the 10th century. A work on Tadbir al-Manzil, which was hugely influential, you know, even within the context of fiqh, as she discusses in her chapter on Sarakhsi. And then finally, the fourth framework, the least developed and by far the most fragmentary, which is the notion of muruwa or muru'a, and you find both kind of forms, literally manliness, but you know, associated with certain virtues of probity, largely gendered, but also something that women can, to a limited extent, cultivate, exemplified by virtues like, as I said, probity and generosity on the part of men. And it's also kind of a reflection of elite status to some extent, and other markers of elite status, which is reflected least, I think, because it's a less developed framework when compared to the other frameworks. So that perhaps leaves us with the discussion of the body chapters and modern developments, which I've already alluded to partly. But yeah, hopefully that's been helpful so far.
No, this is I mean, it's a great overview of a very rich text. As with any of these texts, I mean, this is in its published form will be about 320 pages. There's so much that we could discuss and so many dimensions that we can explore. And so we're only going to really touch on elements of it. And I wanted to also acknowledge we do have quite a few viewers, and you know, someone said Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam. Please feel free to sort of put in your comments in Facebook or YouTube in the chat, and that will be received by us, and we'll be able to respond, inshallah, in the towards the latter part of this discussion, bi'idhnillah. I think that, you know, there are a number of dimensions to this which we could explore. A lot of them are kind of like small fara'i issues, but also some of the sort of broad implications of something like this, because as you, I think, very importantly noted towards the beginning of your presentation, that, you know, this is an issue of considerable contemporary relevance. And I like this about Marion's work, that, I mean, this is something we had a brief discussion about earlier, that Marion is a very sensitive observer from outside the tradition of, and a very sensitive reader, a nuanced reader of a tradition that is not of her own. But as I was once having a conversation with Christopher Melchert about, in a sense, you know, he was just saying, yes, I know more about the Islamic tradition than I know about Christianity. Like these are people who've dedicated their lives to these traditions, which are not of their own. But in some respects, I think they become
their professional lives, at least.
Sorry, say again?
Their professional lives, which is a distinction that should be made.
Yes, but I also think that there's an artificiality in that distinction, meaning these traditions become quite important aspects of these people's identity.
Of course, for sure. And I really appreciate Katz, or I should say Marion, and this is something we both agreed very strongly on, brief but important discussion of her situatedness at the beginning of the book. Something I feel that, especially among non-Muslim scholars, I think to a greater extent than among Muslims, there's a certain reluctance to do. But she even speaks of her gendered upbringing and playing with gendered toys, presumably things like easy bake ovens and so on, if you remember those. But that's something I appreciate, and also the complete lack of what we've mentioned in the previous episode, the Labour historian E.P. Thompson's notion of the enormous condescension of posterity. There's none of that here. And she engages with the jurists, without sharing, of course, their assumptions about gender or the hierarchical nature of the marital relationship. But I find, especially for someone writing in the field of gender, and this may earn some, not everyone will agree, but refreshingly free of condemnation. Really, how much point is there condemning an 11th century jurist for believing in slavery? Had you lived in the 11th century and been a social elite, presumably you would have owned slaves as well. But in any case, I don't want to focus too much on that. But the tone of the book and the humility of the author is, in acknowledging her situatedness, I think are both wonderful points.
I think, the main thing that I would want to bring out of that particular point is that this is something which, practicing Muslims can benefit from quite a good deal, in the sense that, sometimes we've had a really sort of crass example of this in the last week or two within social media, with Jordan Peterson talking down to Muslims. He actually issued some kind of message to all Muslims. I don't encourage watch it because it would add to his view count, but you can watch various reaction videos which will incorporate into it the original video. And yeah, so when it comes to Muslims, need to reflect on a whole host of issues in modernity, and Marion, by writing a book like this, gives them the opportunity to do that with great nuance and sophistication, without a sense of being talked down to. And I think that that's extremely valuable. So I'm grateful to be honest. And
interestingly, this one reason, among others, why people should always read the acknowledgements, who are her scholarly interlocutors and who is giving her feedback on the manuscripts. On the manuscript of this book, largely Muslim female scholars, among others, of course. But that's I think interesting in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. In some respects, just reflecting on positionality is gratefully becoming more and more sort of par for the course. But in some respects, the categories that social scientists work with, and that extends to scholars in the humanities, very often the salient categories are, race, class, and gender. And in that respect,
the unholy trinity, as it's often called.
I've not heard the unholy bit, but yes, I've heard Trinity certainly described there. And I think what's interesting there is, and if some would assimilate sort of race and religion to a certain extent, that's a whole other discussion. But even if in that framework, even if we, for example, fall into the category of a Muslim, we aren't we're gendered male, so to speak, and so she has an insight into some dimensions of this that we can't. And I personally think that those frameworks, even if they're socially constructed, they're sort of aspects of modernity which are inflecting our thinking, but are sort of a product of a very specific context and a specific civilizational tradition or intellectual tradition. I think that there's great deal of benefit for us to reflect on those sorts of that aspect of situatedness, like the sorts of insights that Marion brings to the table will be very valuable and inaccessible to me as a male, I would argue, in certain respects. And yeah, so anyway, just that's a reflection of positionality. I wanted to actually ask you more specifically on that there are fascinating divergences within the tradition that she brings out. So, Mawardi, then she's looking at Sarakhsi and Ibn Taymiyyah. Those are three that particularly sort of struck me as having very divergent approaches to questions of gender. And again, I'm going to think slightly theologically here, but the discourses that you very often come across in modern Islam within traditional sort of like ulama circles, for example, may be quite flat when thinking about, the question of gender. And I wonder, to what extent is this a demonstration that some of these issues are, of course, historically contingent and open to reconstruction in the context of, modernity?
Indeed. And I would agree. I mean, and she explored, although it is a transverse slice rather than a core sample, she is interested in the dynamism of the tradition and the transformation of legal doctrine.
Right.
So thinking of the first chapter, Sahnun states clearly from Ibn al-Qasim that wives are not obligated to do domestic labor. And this is this opinion of Ibn al-Qasim in the formative period of Malikism seems to be the going view, even though it's contested by Abdul Malik bin Habib, the author of Al-Wadiha, and attributed him Adab al-Nisa. Al-Wadiha is only extant in fragments, but he clearly contests this view. He dies in 238 or 239, I forget. And it's also, again, the dissenting view is attributed to Asbagh, student of Malik, who dies in 225, and Ibn al-Majishun. Ibn al-Majishun, I believe, is the student of Malik, and Asbagh is the grand student. Anyway, Ibn al-Majishun dies between 212 and 214. So these early Malikis, as well as a view attributed to Sahnun's son, Muhammad bin Sahnun, also contests this view. So Muhammad bin Sahnun, Marion even cites as saying, may God forgive them of the early Malikis who did not obligate a wife to perform domestic labor. And he's generally associated with more hadith-oriented views, citing the hadith Fatima, which at some point I'm going to have to discuss at great length.
Sure.
But in any case, so you do have these early views contesting this view, but the view of Ibn al-Qasim is prevalent, not obligating them to do housework and so on, is prevalent in this formative period. But by the time in the 14th century of Sidi Khalil, non-elite wives are in fact obligated, to partake in domestic labor. Of course, again, you can nuance that discussion, as, for example, Ibn Habib does in his Wadiha, or perhaps it's Ibn Sahnun. Sorry, my memory is not great these days. By, for example, saying that wives are obligated to do indoor work and not outdoor work, and similarly that they can be compelled to do consumptive labor, so cook for their husbands, but they can't provide goods for sale on the market. That kind of productive outside labor. So there are these distinctions. So there's clear development in the Maliki school, and indeed in the chapter on Sarakhsi. Sarakhsi's views are unprecedented in the sense and in the way in which, within his fiqh text al-Mabsut, he has this kind of two-tiered approach. He distinguishes, as Shaybani and Kitab al-Asl had performed, between ethical, religious, if you like, dini, one way of phrasing the distinction, and legal, strictly legal obligations. You can characterize as dunyawi, if you like. These aren't the terms Shaybani uses, but in any case. Now, it's not this distinction does not pre-exist in some sense. Sarakhsi, it does. But the uniqueness of Sarakhsi's contribution is that he makes this kind of very bold statement that a wife cannot legally be obligated to, cannot be legally compelled to partake in domestic labor. Although, as I said, Ibn Mazah at 616 reports a view from him that, again suggests that marriage and marital norms are not exhausted in any sense by fiqh doctrine, because he says, if a wife does in fact refuse to do these things, the husband can also correspondingly make life difficult for her by adhering to the minimum legal obligation on his part and providing her with wheat bread without any condiments, effectively reducing her to a diet of bread and water. So without kind of extra fiqh norms, Katz, Marion rightly says, marriage is quite a miserable thing. As Saraqsi himself acknowledges.
But
even in the Hanafis.
Sorry, so she does seem to illustrate well, I think, that, she makes it very explicit. Look, the legal discourse is only one frame within which to think about marriage, and it's usually, this is something which
it's not the full story by any stretch of the imagination. Even within fiqh works, that's the interesting thing to often.
They recognize, the fiqh works themselves recognize, and for me it's not
somewhat unevenly, but yeah.
It's not altogether surprising that Saraqsi makes this sort of comment, and Marion's wry comment is very apposite there, to say that if people were to adhere to the legal norms alone, their married lives would be miserable indeed. So but that should be well recognized by people, right?
In the modern period, perhaps not always, but again, in the modern period, we'll return to discussing, there is this unprecedented degree of fusion, to some extent, between the legal and the ethical. So anyway, I've discussed the Maliki school a bit and its doctrinal development. The Hanafis, Abu Hanifa and his students agreed that a wife is not obligated even to provide service for herself. But beginning with Abu Layth as-Samarqandi, who dies in 375 in his Nawazil, I believe, you get the sense that a wife is actually customarily obligated, at least non-elite wives, to do so. And she says that the views of Abu Layth reflect the kind of going mainstream view of the Hanafis, and among Hanafis of the 11th to 14th centuries, this does seem to be increasingly opinion. The Khurasani Hanafis kind of increasingly accommodate, just social reality on this front. So that gives you a sense of the Hanafis. But among later Hanafis, this distinction between ethical, religious, and legal obligation is widely recognized. So that's the Malikis and Hanafis. The Shafi'is are discussed in the chapter on Mawardi, and a number of views attributed to Shafi'i himself is discussed in the footnotes. He seems to have entertained a number of opinions on the subject. But in any case, Mawardi himself very clearly very clearly states that wives cannot be, are not obligated to offer their domestic service to husbands. And in this chapter, she contrasts his Al-Hawi al-Kabir with his Adab al-Dunya wa-Din, where, like in all other works of practical ethics, and of course she draws on a wonderful book, Gendered Morality of Zahra Ayyubi, which looks at the three akhlaq books of Al-Ghazali's Kimya-i Sa'ada, and the so-called Nasirian ethics of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, and also Dawani's ethics, which are largely borrowed from Tusi with some adjustments. In these works of ethics, not unlike Bryson's work on Tadbir al-Manzil, one finds norms that altogether contrast with those of the fiqh, namely that wives' domestic labor is basically taken for granted. There's another important contrast between fiqh works and works of practical philosophy, in that, especially those that were more influenced by Bryson, one finds, Bryson really emphasizes wives as managers of their husbands' estates, particularly in their absence, whence the importance of marrying an intelligent wife. Bryson is not interested in virtue ethics in the kind of Aristotelian sense, another tradition, but of course, with the translation of the Nicomachean ethics by I always confuse Hunayn bin Ishaq and Ishaq bin Hunayn. They were father and son.
Okay. Okay.
Ibn Hunayn died 289 anyway. The Nicomachean Ethics was translated into Arabic and was hugely influential. Before Bryson, it was translated in the 10th century. But anyway, Bryson is so influential that Ibn al-Jawzi, the Hanbali, and Sayyid al-Khatir basically summarizes his work of Tadbir al-Manzil. And the work is drawn on in sources as diverse as Ghazali's Ihya, Sarakhsi's Mabsut, less explicitly, and certainly in the Akhlaq works, it's a key influence. Miskowayh leans more on Aristotle. But in any case, Bryson is this hugely influential figure. Among the Shafis you have, there is an important distinction between the Shafis and the Hanafis. Now, I will discuss the Hanbalis, but one thing I really ought to emphasize is, Katz, or Marion rather, draws a lot on the fantastic work of Kishali, particularly Marriage and Slavery, although the same kind of discussions reappear in her essay in Hamid Safi's 2003 Progressive Muslims volume, where Kisha Ali, as I remember, expresses her wariness of the appropriation of certain aspects of pre-modern legal doctrine, such as tafweed al-talaq, delegating to, termination of the marriage to wives, because she says, well, it's actually, you can't ignore the bigger context of delegation in this one example, which is the asymmetric and highly gendered exchange of marital obligations and duties, as envisioned by most classical jurists. So Kisha Ali, more than anyone else, I would say, has emphasized to us how most jurists imagined or conceptualized the marital contract as an unequal and gendered exchange of dawah, meher, and support, nafaqah, for sexual availability. A number of phrases are used, including the idea of tamkeen and so on. This was the view of most jurists. Mm-hmm. Now, the non-obligation of wives' responsibility for domestic labor is a function of, and emerges clearly from, this conceptualization of the marital contract. What do I mean? Kisha Ali tells us that jurists say marriage is exchange of basically sex for money, to boil it down to its most basic elements, if you like. And therefore, this domestic labor is exempt from this equation. Ibn al-Mundhir, Marion tells us, says, explicitly, jurists who do not obligate a wife to undertake domestic labor do not do this on the basis of any hadith or scriptural text, but on the basis of their own deductions, essentially this kind of conceptualization of the marital contract. Now, this gives an opportunity for, and this is where I'll probably discuss the hadith Fatima, which is subject to a Harvard Islamic Law blog post, which I would refer readers to. Perhaps in the comments I can post the link to these very helpful books, because there she lays out the discussion a bit more clearly than she does here, because she has the kind of space to elaborate it. Jurists like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, who to a much greater extent perhaps than any other pre-modern jurists, emphasize a wife's legal obligation as determined by custom, and they absolutely privilege the Quranic notion of ma'ruf, that which is both customarily known to be right, is associated with what is good and what is just, and so on. Adl, or justice, being a kind of foremost preoccupation of Ibn Taymiyyah, as a number of scholars have observed. They say a wife is so obligated, and they do so especially with reference to scriptural texts, not least the Hadith Fatima. Now, what is the Hadith Fatima? Before I turn it over again to our discussion of Zana. Now, I'm characterizing the Hadith Fatima as one text, but that could be contested, I suppose. It actually occurs in a number of starkly divergent variants. Bukhari, Muslim in their Sahihs, and Ahmed in his Musnad report a form where, essentially, to summarize, Fatima complains to the Prophet ﷺ that she's being worn out by domestic work, grinding corn and grain and so on, and asks the Prophet ﷺ to provide her with, help, in the form of a slave, a captive from war, and so on. And the Prophet says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, should I not, tell you what is better, essentially? And then he provides her with these formulae of tasbih, glorifying God before bedtime, which hopefully everyone does. 33 times. Subhanallah, alhamdulillah, and Allahu Akbar, and so on. Anyway, that's one, by the standards of classical hadith criticism, rigorously authentic version of the report. However, what seems to be a much more widely cited in the legal literature, at least, version of the report, which is found in Ibn Habib. It's found in I looked up the takhrij of this online on Muntakha al-Hadith, because Marion says this version of the hadith is, not great by classical hadith standards, and she cites Ibn Battal in his Sharh of Bukhari, I think, saying that, our scholars didn't know this anyway. But that version is much more explicit about the obligation of a wife's domestic labor, saying that the Prophet ﷺ divides between Fatima and Ali labor that is batina and zahira. So somewhat anticipating, Marion says, the modern kind of gendered household division of labor. Fatima, you're responsible for what goes on inside the house, Ali for what goes on outside the house. Now that version of the report is much more explicit about a wife's obligation, but it is also somewhat lackluster. As well as Ibn Habib, it's reported by sources as diverse as Abu Nu'aym in his Hilya, if I remember, Hannad al-Kufi in his Kitab al-Zuhd, is it Musannad bin Musarhad or Musannad bin Musarhad, an obscure figure in his Musnad. Sorry?
Musaddad?
I think Musaddad bin Muhannad bin Musarhad. Anyway, I'll mess that up. But anyway, yes, the obscure figure as a Musnad I wasn't previously aware of. And other sources, and the hadith is both mursal and contains the rawi, I think his name is Abu Bakr bin Abdullah bin Ibn Abi Maryam, who is weak. So that version of the report, although much more frequently encountered in fiqh works and more explicit about a wife's obligation, is also weaker. So, Ibn Taymiyyah and al-Qayyim, Ibn al-Qayyim cites both the reports, but of course the one of Bukhari is more relevant to him. Now, in contrast, Ibn Qudama, who cites the hadith Fatima and says, well, this labor of Fatima pertains only to the domain of ethical religious obligation rather than legal obligation. I mean, Ibn Qudama, not unlike Sarakhsi, basically suggests, well, for the sake of the good order of the household, a wife should indeed do these things, but she's not legally obligated to do so. And Ibn al-Qayyim, whose most sustained discussion of this is in Zad al-Ma'ad, and I think in the footnotes, Marion emphasizes how the works of Ibn al-Qayyim, especially, are very genre-bending. I mean, a work like Zad al-Ma'ad does not really recognizably belong to any genre. And similarly with works like Ibn Taymiyyah's Siyas al-Shari'ah and so on. Anyway, one strange thing is that I forget which scholar Katz refers to in the footnotes, refers to Ibn Taymiyyah's so-called fatwa work, Majmu' al-Fatawa, seemingly unaware of the fact that it wasn't compiled by Ibn Taymiyyah or his students, but by a modern compiler, Abdurrahman bin Qasim, Saudi figure. Anyway, so Ibn al-Qayyim in the Zad says very entertainingly, well, if you're not going to obligate a wife to serve her husband, then effectively a husband is the one who is serving his wife and is her servant and slave, one could say, which of course reverses the natural order of things as Ibn al-Qayyim imagines. And now the view of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim is of course a hierarchical one. There is a reciprocal element to it as well, but it is a view of, if you like, I forget the exact phrase Marion uses, but we can characterize it as a kind of benevolent patriarchy, in which not only are wives obligated according to customary norms and social status and so on to provide their husbands with domestic labor, but husbands, to an extent, not met anywhere else, I suppose, husbands are also obliged, similarly, in accordance with what is ma'ruf, customarily known and established as just and so on, towards their wives. And one of the views which is characterized as one of the ikhtiyarat or distinctive opinions of Ibn Taymiyyah, perhaps even unique, is that unlike those jurists such as Ibn Qudamah who say, using the analogy of ila, or husband who takes the oath to abstain from sex with his wife for 4 months based on the Quran, that a husband is only legally obligated to provide his wife with sex once every 4 months. It's a kind of, analogy. Ibn Taymiyyah says no, he's actually obliged to provide his wife with sex according to her need and his capacity, in accordance with al-ma'ruf. And he says that a marriage can even be dissolved on these grounds, whether the husband's incapacity is intentional or simply a result of lack of capacity. So there is an interesting reciprocity. In Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, though, the relationship as a whole, as is true of all the other jurists, is a hierarchical one. But Ibn Taymiyyah, although all the jurists, very commonly draw on this analogy of marriage with slavery, Ibn Taymiyyah emphasizes it more, because he's more indebted to the language of hadith, which, in some places compare a wife, metaphorically to a captive of her husband, so treat your captives well, and so on. This is the kind of ethos in the hadith. Ibn Taymiyyah does emphasize this, and Ibn al-Qayyim following this hierarchical nature, but it should be a kind of benevolent and, as I said, somewhat reciprocal relationship.
If I just briefly interject on the Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim sort of approach, that one was quite sort of interesting, mind-bending in interesting ways, because, it has these sort of approaches which would be seen as paradoxical within sort of the modern frame, at the same time as, legitimating a wife's demand in those sorts of arenas. The transformation that the two of them instantiate with respect to Ibn Qudamah's position, which is such a minimalist sort of contract. Ibn Qudamah is basically the absolute minimal component that...
he's the standard nafaqa and meher for tamkeen guy. Right. You speak of them instantiating a transformation, drawing on Ahmad al-Shamsi, of course. Marion emphasizes how Ibn Taymiyyah's works and views have been popularized, but their views do not actually change the standard view of the school.
Right.
Interestingly, they have a complex relationship with the...
they don't have an impact until modernity, in a sense. But in what's interesting for me is that they also, in addition to giving the wife these sorts of prerogatives, you could argue, because of the hierarchical nature of that relationship, they significantly circumscribe the space that she has to engage in contracts outside of that contract, right? So, Ibn says that you can, outside of the base contract of the marriage, which is nafaqa for tamkeen, etc., you can, hire each other. The husband and wife can hire each other, and then that's completely out of the question in Ibn Taymiyyah and al-Qayyim's position.
Indeed, I should say something about contracts, because this is a really key point, again, drawn on Kisha Ali. The Hanbali school, and this has been recognized by many scholars, including Hussam Arabi has an interesting paper on this, mentioned by Katz. Very underappreciated scholar, in my opinion. At one point, he was based at the University of Balamand in Lebanon, not far from Tripoli, actually, in Lebanon, my mother's home city. I don't know what's going on with him now, but a really good scholar. Had a volume of essays, which is just, superb. Anyway, the Hanbalis, to a much greater extent than the other schools, recognize freedom of contract. So as long as contractual stipulations, shurut, do not invalidate or negatively impact the essentials of the contract. So, for example, a marital contract where it's agreed that the husband will not have sex with the wife, that's an invalid, condition. As long as they don't violate the integrals of the contract, Hanbalis, and this is why modern civil law and much of the Arab world kind of favors this Hanbali stance, as does the Majalla, if I'm not mistaken, of the Ottomans, as discussed by Hussein Arabi. Because of this freedom to contract, this is kind of proven very amenable to modern kind of reformists and codifiers of Islamic law. But Ibn Taymiyyah, as far as marriage is concerned, basically repudiates not so much the freedom of contract in a general sense, but the very strict sense of marriage as a contractual exchange of nafaqa and mahr for tamkeen. Because for him, that's, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, Marion really emphasizes to a much greater extent than perhaps any other pre-modern jurists, really collapsed the distinction between law and ethics. And she doesn't refer to him, but I really think, I don't think I understood Fazl Rahman's critique that there's no genuine form of Islamic ethics was developed in the pre-modern period until I read this book, which is credit to Katz. Why? What does he mean by that? Now, when Fazl Rahman, of course, likes being provocative and so on. He's a very interesting guy to think with and discuss with. His point is that, yes, we have this akhlaq tradition. It's largely indebted to the Greeks and their practical philosophy and so on. And Ibn Taymiyyah, again, repudiates as inferior to revealed norms whatever the Greeks have to tell us about Tadbir al-Manzil. The Prophet ﷺ is a much better guide than Aristotle. But Fazl Rahman said, yeah, we have that tradition of ethics. And Fazl Rahman is very interested in the distinction between law and ethics. And he gives the example of Hiya, legal stratagems, as an example of this distinction. But he says, he believes that fiqh norms were not sufficiently infused by ethical concerns. And I think one of the major reasons he finds Ibn Taymiyyah such a congenial theologian and kind of moralist is that Ibn Taymiyyah, in a sense, is making the same critique, right? I mean, and that's really, really interesting. Like, so I have to, I really owe that to Katz. I didn't really truly appreciate Rahman, because you can just dismiss Rahman and say, well, actually, fiqh is an ethical discourse. Of course, fiqh is an ethical discourse. Now, there's a long-standing debate she discusses, involving whether Asad and Talal Asad and Wal Halaq and even Snooker Gronya, the Dutch, infamous Dutch Orientalist, perhaps even a Muslim, whom, as Perry Bauman tells us, married and had a child with a prepubescent wife. Anyway, that's a long story. In her book on the Encyclopedia of Islam. But yeah, I mean, this, and we've already discussed Johansson's distinction between this kind of dunyawi and dini, if you like, aspects of fiqh. So Hanafi jurists were making that distinction. But, Rahman's critique is quite Taymiyyan, and it's really brought out in this discussion of Ibn Taymiyyah's views on the obligation of a wife's domestic labor for her husband. So that was a really interesting point.
I mean, what you say just brings to mind the fact that this is also a major sort of point of contention in contemporary legal philosophy. So you have the sort of natural law school, which is, I don't know who would be the major upholders of natural law, but I had the opportunity to study a bit with Robert George at Princeton. But you have the positivist school upheld by people like H.L.A. Hart and Joseph Raz, which, so that natural lawyers basically said law and ethics had to be integrated, and positive law basically argues that no, law is a distinct enterprise from ethics. And it would be interesting. I'm sure someone started having a look at it or has had a serious look at it, simply unaware. But look at how that sort of dilemma really transcends traditions and civilizations.
Yeah. I mean, this book is by far the most nuanced, richly documented, sophisticated account of the distinction between law and ethics in the Islamic tradition, focusing on one particular case study.
Fascinating.
And yeah, I mean, I can mention just incidentally aspects of other chapters, perhaps. So,
sure.
In the first chapter, as I said, on this exposed zuhud, but also Maliki legal views and the Mudawwana in particular. By Sarakhsi's time, Central Asian 11th century, this notion of khidmah, which began off as fairly simple reference to labor and service, becomes overlaid and complicated by, and the kind of semantic field of khidma expands to include things like the slowly crystallizing ideals of Sufism, and also the dyadic and hierarchical relationships, say, between parents and children and rulers and the subjects. So khidma has a much broader sense already in a Sarakhsi and is mabsud. And khidma is necessarily hierarchical and reflects on, in some sense, social difference. So Sarakhsi even says that even paid work, and it's interesting for us wage slaves, the paid work of a Muslim for a non-Muslim employer is makruh, because there's a kind of social difference involved in this relationship of khidma, of service. Very interesting idea.
I missed that. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so Sarakhsi, if I remember correctly, basically says a Muslim's engaging in contract work for non-Muslim is makruh, because it's detestable, not prohibited, because any kind of khidma entails a relationship of social difference, and you can kind of recognize an element of that, perhaps. Very interesting.
You're a subordinate of anyone whom you're.
And Sarakhsi makes a lot, as I've already said, of this distinction between ethical, religious, and legal obligations. And you find both deeply structuring his discussion of a wife's domestic labor and the mabsud. And that's fascinating. And Mawardi, of course, lives in a context in Baghdad. He's an ambassador for the Abbasid caliphs al-Qadir and al-Qa'im, most popularly associated with theological tradition. You have the i'tiqad of al-Qadiri, the kind of neo-Hanbali caliph, if you like. Although Mawardi seems to exhibit, even Mu'tazili tendencies theologically. He's an interesting chap. And Awaymer, she cites, very characteristically says of Mawardi's political project,
right,
that he seems to have exhibited like split personality.
Multi-personality.
Challenged by Mona Hassan, who emphasizes the kind of continuity of his project. But in terms of domestic labor and the contrast between the Al-Hawl al-Kabir and Adab al-Dunya wa-Din, Marion basically says they are broadly complementary. And one overall point she makes a number of places in the book is, yes, of course, there can be tension between these various normative frameworks, normative registers, but they are broadly complementary, and jurists often, even jurists would invoke them within the same work, like Sarakhsi, or in different works like Mawardi, understood that to some extent they involved asking different questions and had different audiences and providing different answers and so on. So, fiqh and akhlaq are not doing the same work. You can't ask the same questions of them, and you can't get the same answers out of them, right? Fiqh is concerned with minimal legally enforceable rights and claims, on the most basic level.
Right.
It's a serious error to people like Mawardi to suggest that fiqh is like a total moral account of humankind's duties towards each other and towards their creator. Yeah. As we said, a marriage that is dictated and regulated solely in terms of fiqh is a very miserable marriage that no one would want to be in. Right. And both husbands and wives can kind of make each other's lives difficult in various ways. Now, like Yossi Rappaport, Katz gives three possible reasons for Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim's interventions. One of which is the kind of shift that happened in some doctrinal views of scholars of the Madhab, like Khalil, happening in the 13th and 14th centuries. Another being, drawing on the work of Yossi Rappaport, this objection to what in the Mamluk period is the monetization of marriage. Jurists in the Mamluk period and context had basically mostly recognized that these obligations owed to a wife could and should be expressed in monetary form. So you did not owe a wife nafaqah in the form of providing her with housing and so on in the conventional sense. You could provide these in the form of monetary amounts. Development that Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah both heavily contested. They said this is not in accordance with al-Ma'ruf, and most Muslims would not, this doesn't make sense to them. And
which
the third
schools,
development...
Incidentally, which schools was this particularly dominant in within?
I mean, Rappaport in his book, My Marriage and Divorce, suggested it's kind of seems to have been broadly understood. I can't remember what he says about specifically there, but it seems to have become a broadly accepted enforceable norm in Mamluk courts.
Yeah.
One reason why they object to this monetization is, Ibn al-Qayyim, the point I just made, I made previously from Marion about, well, if a wife isn't so obligated to provide domestic labor, then the husband is effectively a slave or a servant. Wives could and did get their husbands in trouble over by backdating nafaqah payments that were in fact paid, and they could really put the squeeze on the husband. Something Ibn al-Qayyim is acutely aware of, mentions.
Sorry, my recollection is again, I mean, you're a more careful reader than I am, but that she was basically making the point that they were very troubled by the possibility that a wife could litigate for unpaid payments. I mean, not that.
Oh, but it happened. It happened.
But
it wasn't a theoretical concern. It really happened.
But you also suggest that wives were doing this in an illicit fashion. They were sort of making claims that were not actually. Sort of...
Yes and no. So they could do this perfectly licitly within the domain of fiqh, but you could say it's unethical. I mean, Yossi has a great paper. My friend Tariq Atami introduced me to many years ago, a mutual friend, on Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and his, let's say, complex domestic life, where basically he persuades his wife. It's worth a 1-minute summary because it's such a fascinating paper, drawing largely on Sakhawi and other sources. Sakhawi, of course, being Ibn Hajar, a student that's very well informed from his Ad-Daw al-Lami' al-Qarn al-Tasi' biographical dictionary, which is very gossipy, as Yossi says. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani persuades his wife to sell a female slave of her she finds attractive, then sends a friend to secretly purchase her on his behalf, sets up said female slave in a love nest, and eventually has a child with her. His wife finds out, and to put it in the modern parlance, presumably he spends a lot of time sleeping on the couch. Now, Ibn Hajar's wife, with whom he had 4 daughters, does not put the squeeze on him and doesn't. She could have, I mean, really, because I think he was living in a house that she owned. She could have really messed him up had she wanted to. And I think Yossi suggested because of the love and the children they had together, she doesn't do so. He kind of speculates. But had she gone to a Mamluk court, I mean, and demanded payment that was owed and all of this, I think he may have even borrowed money from her, if I'm not mistaken, and all of that business. I mean, she could have sent him to the cleaners and had them imprisoned, even imprisoned as a debtor potentially. That's something that did happen in the Mamluk period. And Ibn al-Qayyim says this is crazy, the way husbands are being treated. And of course, paraphrasing.
I mean, what I notice in the Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim sort of conception is this hierarchical component becomes all important. It's like, a wife taking the husband to court is like a child taking their parents to court. That's the sort of dynamic.
Specifically for things like this, of course, they would recognize there. Ibn Taymiyyah says, as I mentioned, mentioning Marion's thing, that a judge could dissolve a marriage for a husband's neglect of his wife's sexual needs, right? So it's not that Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't recognize that wives don't have recourse. They do. They can go to judges, but yeah, so it does become the hierarchical element, in some sense at least, becomes paramount. I should say, going back to this, because all kinds of thoughts are prompted by this book, which is a testimony to the scope of the author's achievement. Thank you, Marion. So Sarakhsi says this kind of khidmah is, if you like, you could even say building on him, inherently degrading in some sense. Why? Because it's suggestive of hierarchy and difference. Now, this reminds me, and I think I did mention this in a previous episode, a lot of Luke Yabra's book, Friends of the Emir, basically about non-Muslims in government service, for Muslims and so on. Coptic scribes in the Mamluk chancery or what have you. And basically, jurists became to summarize, jurists became more critical of this practice over time, especially in the Mamluk period. The Mamluk period is very interesting for Muslim non-Muslim relations, as Yabra mentions. But this contrasts with the early period. Why? And he gives some really interesting anecdotes from early sources. Al-Hajjaj tells, I think, his sons, or one of his sons, that he should learn, how to swim and other things like this. But he says, you don't have to learn how to write because you can get a non-Muslim to do this for you. We forget the fact, or later jurists forgot the fact, in the context of non-Muslim employment in the Muslim state, that service is inherently degrading, right? Early Muslims were a conquest elite. We said, citing Krona, perhaps no more than 5% of the population. They had a ton of slaves to do, all of these things for them. They could, as Melchett suggested before Sufism, devote themselves to worship because, whether grinding grain and preparing dough for bread or any of these washing clothes and other toilsome and tedious chores, they could have, probably Muslim from fairly early, but they could have slaves do this for them, even though, of course, wives in early sources, as Marion mentions, are frequently mentioned as having, actually done these things. But we shouldn't forget, and I think it's, especially for men, as you mentioned early on in this episode, one very important, I wouldn't necessarily use this language. People always talk today about the importance of acknowledging one's privilege. Now, one mustn't disregard the fact that, without the help of wives and slaves and so on, it simply wouldn't be possible for, a figure like Ghazali, to produce his works. He abandons his family for some years and goes wandering, and this leads him to produce that here. But even more generally, I think these early Zuhayd, as Ignorant Matson says, they had servants or basically slaves, and their piety, to some extent, was dependent on the fact that other people would do all of this boring, tedious stuff for them, freeing them up to devote themselves to what really mattered. Now, Zahra Ayyubi, in her book, which is focused not on fiqh, but on works of practical philosophy, and particularly Tadbir al-Manzil, really emphasizes how, in those works, Marion also says, a wife's domestic labor is not only assumed, but is largely divested of the religious element one finds in works of Zuhd, where to cultivate humility, Omar bin Abdul Aziz renounces taraka and yukhtam, I think is the Arabic phrase, symbolically and only intermittently and partially renounces the service of others for him. In practice, most of the time, even these early Zuhayd were actually being served by slaves, and of course by their wives as well, it's fair to assume, domestically. So, there is this disjuncture between, emphasized throughout the book, between, a complex disjuncture, I should say, and then one that casts nuances between legal and ethical religious obligation as far as it pertains to wives' domestic labor.
I mean, it's fascinating. One of the things that she does point out is that at the same time, in certain biographical dictionary contexts, when it comes to Zuhayd, when the Zahid is engaged in this menial task, it is valorized as spiritual khidmah, but it is devalorized, if that's a term, or denuded of those qualities when it's, the impression one gets is it's not even acknowledged as a thing, as something spiritual.
Somewhat unevenly. So in Sufi and ethical works, Katz mentions, you do find, even in Ibn Habib's Adab al-Nisa, Abdul Malik bin Habib, you do find, fulsome praise of a wife's the other worldly rewards of a wife engaging in this domestic labor, which, in contrast to his legal work in Adab an-Nisa, he says is not obligatory upon her. And even in works of Wa'adh, and she mentions the work of this Hamawi scholar from the 10th Hijri century, whose name escapes me, kind of cajoling his male audience, again, largely with rhetorical force. Basically, you should acknowledge the service these wives are doing for you, and you'd only truly appreciate its value if they were charging you a wage for this. Hopefully his name will return to me. Right. And jurists like Ibn Abi Zayd al-Khayrawani, dies 386, while acknowledging that wives were not obligated to provide this service to husbands, particularly those of elite backgrounds. Ibn Taymiyyah, by the way, seems to reject this distinction between elites and commoners, citing the hadith Fatima, because Fatima is, of course, reluctant to do the slave and requests a slave to assist her. Fatima is the most elite of elites and the best of the best, so we reject this distinction anyway. Ibn Abi Zayd, kind of in fatwa attributed to him and other authors in later sources, kind of fudges and suggests that no, it's mubalagha, not necessary for a husband to inform his wife that this is not actually her obligation. And he assumes that wives would be aware of this. Whether he actually really believes that or not is somewhat unclear. And Katz says, it seems to be quite exceptional. Husbands really insist, and it's kind of out of wara and ihtiyat, that husbands clarify this point. She gives us something of an exception. Othman Danfodio dies 1817, who kind of sort of implies husbands should do so, but in a very specific kind of ethical context, he mentions this. I should probably say something about the one period. Do you have, other kind of? So
I did. There's so much to say here, but there was also a question from Besnik. So Besnik Sinai. This is from an hour ago, actually, almost. So I should address that, and then I can come back to maybe some of the other things that I talked about. Okay, let's do that, and then I have just a reflection as well. So this is from Besnik. I might have missed it. Does Katz's book discuss the post-madhab and reformist discussions on this topic?
Perfect. So yes, in the 19th century, especially in response to European notions of domesticity, she discusses developments in the European context as well, right. Euro-American context, I should say. So, she doesn't mention him, but prior to the mid-19th century, very often William Blackstone's commentary on Commentaries on the Laws of England is kind of cited as this, exemplifying the notion that prior to this mid-19th century reform, wives, persons, and labor and property simply belonged to their husbands in English, common law. Wives were not legally distinct from their husbands as persons. Very much contrasting with Islamic law, where wives were certainly distinct as persons and their property was also distinct. Things kind of changed somewhat beginning in the mid-19th century, and wives' property is distinguished from that of husbands. So they're entitled to earn wages, for example. However, there's a kind of a creation of the domestic sphere whereby a wife's labor in a domestic context is exempted from this equation, and she can't be paid, any attempt to enforce a marital contract or agreement between a husband and wife, courts will repudiate the idea that she can be paid for domestic labor, because this domestic labor belongs to the domestic sphere, and it's all lovey-dovey and cannot be tainted by market relations. Ibn Qudama, because of the Hanbali freedom of contract, of course, says, no, actually, a wife can be paid, and to a much greater extent than other madhabs recognized by the Hanbalis because of their views on the freedom of contract, and so far as it doesn't vitiate the integrals of contracts. So you get an increasing emphasis on domesticity in the modern period among non-Muslims, and then reflected for good and for ill among Muslims. Rashida's views are discussed at some length in Al-Manar. He says that if you ask Muslims, they'll, common Muslims, they will reflect, at least in a perfunctory fashion, this view that wives are not obligated to do domestic work for their husbands. However, he kind of seemingly supports Ibn Taymiyyah's views on this point, and so do the other jurists, modern jurists mentioned by Katz, Mohammed Mukhtar al-Shanqiti, Ibn Uthaymeen, Ibn Jibreen, and Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the very influential, of course, Yusuf al-Qaradawi. One of the, I kind of not really sure how I feel about this. One, she suggests somewhat unprecedented development is the gendering of the fitrah in the modern period, and how it comes to be, the women are kind of associated with domestic work in that way. I mean, she seems to emphasize, including in the footnotes, Katz, that this, fitrah was really a primarily theological concept, and this gendering is unprecedented. It's tying to domestic spheres and so on. I mean, I'm sure one could find many counterexamples to contradict this. I mean, that's just my sense, the idea that, the fitrah of woman is domesticity, and at least on that level.
The impression that I have, for what it's worth, is that this really becomes something important in modern Western discourses, and it may be that's Victorian discourses influencing Egypt. So, but sure. I don't know. Perhaps I'm not well read enough in the fitrah discourses of medieval.
I mean, of course, Katz would not say the equation of woman and domestic labor is purely modern, because you have jurists like Ibn Taymiyyah making this point about marriage,
right?
Not women generally. But yeah, I mean that's maybe, so I don't know. Perhaps one could complicate or even push back to some extent against this observation. Right. But anyway, those are some of the broad developments. Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, because his works, as Ahmed Shamsi points out, are printed widely in the 17th and 20th century. His views do become rather popular, even among jurists like Qaradawi, something of a freelancer. Right. But she suggests between the 14th and 19th century, some of these tensions and or complementarities between the ethical, or I should say the ethical religious, and the legal remain. So Maliki doctrine has shifted by the time of Khalil and down to the present day. I mean, Khalil is basically the madhab as far as many Malikis are still concerned today.
Yeah.
There is another very interesting development in the modern period in Iran in, I think, 1992, and in Morocco, of course, relevant to us being married to Morocco in 2004. Right. There is this argument enacted in law in Iran and Morocco. I don't really know what its afterlife in Iran is after 92, but certainly in Morocco it's still enforced that, classical fiqh does not, here it's assumed in many Western legal contexts, for instance, that when a wife and husband divorce, I mean, it actually varies from Western legal system, and even between English and Scots law, there is some actual variation. Right. I understand from my time in Edinburgh, but typically we can kind of say that when a wife and husband divorce, let's say they've been married for a certain number of years, that the property is split half down the middle, the assets are divided between them. Whereas in classical Sunni fiqh, the assumption is that, let's say a husband is providing, a wife can of course reclaim her property, but husband is only obligated, many jurists would say, to provide her with alimony up until the end of the iddah.
Yeah.
In any case, these modern legal reforms draw on the notion suggested by some jurists that a wife is entitled, but however making this a retrospective right or retroactive right, that basically at the point of dissolution of a marriage, a wife can retroactively claim basically her domestic labor in the form of monetary compensation. So you can kind of divide the marital assets based on her contribution to marital household through her domestic labor. So this seems to be a largely modern, it's really a modern idea, basically, at least in this form. So that's another interesting one.
Right.
Another interesting development.
Perhaps I can sort of reflect on that with you briefly. I mean, one of the challenges, of course, is we think about sort of husband and wives as equal free agents in modernity, or men and women in that way. And so, in a context where women can earn significant amounts in sort of modern economies, they have purchasing power in a way I assume that they didn't necessarily have for much of their history. I mean,
I'm accepting elites, but I mean, one thing I really should emphasize, by the way, because I said this work is of tremendous relevance to Muslims and even non-Muslims in a different sense. I remember at Edinburgh, I taught a course on gender and ethics where, as soon as Zahra Ayyubi's book came out, I assigned the chapter on Tadbir al-Manzil to my students, and they just loved it because, all kinds of interesting discussions came out about, I'm typically in a Western context, it's sort of assumed that a man and wife will, in heterosexual marriage, will contribute to the household income if they're both working. However, in practice, as is widely recognized and statistically demonstrated and so on, what happens is that, yes, they both contribute, and it's still the case, by the way, that men tend to contribute more financially because they still tend to earn more than a woman for all kinds of complicated sociological reasons we won't enter into. But women still offer, the great majority of domestic labor, whether it's in the form of childcare or household chores. So effectively, you have a situation that's, from any perspective, not equitable at all, because neither are you dividing responsibilities between husband and wife equally, or even in proportionately, nor are you entitling her to support, material support from her husband. So it's like a double whammy, if you like. And the book opens by referring to this kind of long-standing motif. In the 1890s, the female Ottoman novelist Fatima Aliya, who dies in 1936, son of the Ottoman statesman Medjid Pasha, gives these anecdotes of the Caliph Omar, whom when a Muslim comes to him complaining of his wife's arguments and disobedience, he hears Omar's wife arguing with him. Omar says, you have to look at the fact that a wife isn't obligated to provide you with all of these things, and yet she breastfeeds your child, and she's your cook and your nursemaid and your washerwoman, and all of these duties rolled into one. So from the late 19th century, many Muslims did actually try to kind of trump the Western or Euro-American critique of Muslim gender norms by saying, well, actually, we don't obligate our women to do domestic labor, which, in the late 19th century did still reflect the majority view across the madhahib, generally speaking. Certainly among the Hanbalis, not so much among the Malikis, but among Shafi'is and to a lesser extent Hanafis as well. So that's a kind of interesting response to this critique, but by saying, well, actually it's Western women who are oppressed because they're not, they have to provide this labor, or at least they're expected to do so, and they're not entitled to their own earnings. Anyway, kind of different kinds of
I mean, it is sort of, it's a challenge which no society or no civilization escapes, really, because the question of, okay, well, there need to be family units, there needs to be earning, there needs to be raising of the children.
Balance of some kind, right? I mean,
sorry?
But, at a very basic level, as we've discussed before, like, if a society can't reproduce itself, it's failing in its most basic function. If it can't keep the fertility rate, or at least by means of immigration, above replacement level, it will eventually see catastrophic population decline. I didn't realize any of this stuff about domestic labor until I had nephews, and my sister, gave birth to Ziyad and Karim. Like, you don't realize, I had lots of friends with kids, including you, you don't really realize until it happens in your immediate context, immediate family, how much labor is involved in looking after children. I mean, I live in a rented room, and cleaning up and looking after myself is easy, but children really change the equation dramatically, right? You can speak from experience about this.
Right. I'm actually in my children's room, and off camera the place is chaotic, right? So I mean, they're away at the moment, but just having the energy to literally tidy a room up, 7-8 times a day is something which takes a great. Now, I mean, the problem is
listening to this.
Yes. remarked in that way in the past, and you kind of become inured to sort of noise and sort of disruption. I mean, we had to do that during lockdown, but I do the main breadwinning in this household, and so in a sense, we have a division of labor in the house where my wife does most of the sort of childcare, and the question that arises, I guess, in the modern context, and this is something which, in some respects, the Islamic tradition is quite exceptional. I think Marion kind of highlights this in not requiring, in theory, in legal theory at least, women to do the housework. That it's only really sort of nafaqa, sukna for tamkeen, and in that.
To be honest, I don't know enough about other traditions, but I don't think she really says much in the comparative context. But I would assume it's pretty unique, right? I mean, I would assume without knowing more.
Right. I mean, yes, in a sense, like just biologically speaking, women are going to do child rearing because that's sort of, I mean, in a sense, I think the conditions that you find in early Islam are somewhat unusual by the standards of a lot of contexts where, the Prophet
I assume so. I mean,
is nursed by someone else. The fact that you have wet nurses in this way, I'm not familiar with how many cultures have that. And then
wet nurses, I should say, it's actually it's been discussed in scholarship by Europeanists.
Okay.
Today we're used to this sort of breast is best, mother feeds child, but certainly among elites in Europe prior to the 19th century, elite women would not have fed their own children. They would have, farmed this out and on elite women to do it for them. I mean, another aspect of childbearing and looking after children is, I mean, it does a number on your body, or so I'm told.
Right.
It's extremely strenuous and, destructive even to some extent.
Yes and no. I mean, the Prophet's mother wasn't an elite woman, but she still had a wetness. I mean,
yeah, it was common in Jahiliyyah.
Yeah. I mean, there are. But one of the things that and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is breastfeeding actually reduces the chance of incidence of breast cancer, for example. So there are other sort of potential health benefits. So, but I guess the question that arises is that, how does, as you suggested, how does society reproduce itself in sufficient numbers? And we have, this as there was an article in the BBC, like a few weeks ago, talking about the quote unquote jaw-dropping rates of decline. And what happens in Western societies really is that we're sorry? Demographically speaking, jaw-dropping demographic decline. I mean, we're externalizing that sort of dimension to parts of the world where they haven't adopted the ideology of, sort of reduced numbers of children and economic activity on.
To be honest, I mean, I think in a sense it has been adopted everywhere, just in less radical forms. So, colleagues here a friend who does field work among or ethnography among young Saudi males says he doesn't really come across many who say they want more than 3 children. But 3 kids by British standards is rather a lot.
I think the current fertility rate is around 1.8 in the UK, and 2.1 is replacement. I mean, we actually have a society where, like, the traditional pyramid has squashed at the bottom, and will start to shrink at the bottom. But I mean, if you look at African countries in particular, if you look at countries like Iraq and places like that,
I mean, the Muslim majority world generally, you have a big youth bulge.
Yes, I mean, which is often a source of certain challenges as well. But it's just that we're not necessarily sort of like, by changing the way in which we govern sort of domestic work versus economic sort of or gainful employment in a way that serves the domestic realm. By changing that equation, we're not necessarily. It's kind of like what Ehud Toledano says about sort of slavery. By tajfif al-manabi' of the sources of slavery internal to the Muslim empire, it just created pressures of importation from inside the empire, and I think that's what's happening in the context of the West as well.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. I wonder if I can get your thoughts on the following, which is, and there are a number of solutions, at least in the context of a particular couple, which is,
Right.
either they are wealthy enough to contract childcare to someone else, they have a live-in au pair, which of course require, in the UK is you have to be rich, basically.
I mean, to be honest,
childcare is prohibitively expensive.
lives in is more cost effective very often than having someone who's who comes in and does short-term childcare. It's really, in the UK it's prohibitively expensive generally.
Yeah, I mean, another solution is what happened in many kind of Eastern Bloc communist states, and I think to some extent it's still true in some of them as a legacy of communism, because they wanted to get as many women to the market workforce as possible, wage labor,
right,
or whatever it was. So very cheap, heavily subsidized or even free state provision of childcare.
Right.
Now in the UK, I guess the political will just doesn't seem to exist for that.
Right. I mean, recently there have been soundings that are complaining about, we've got a low fertility rate now, but
again, I mean, it's like the housing crisis. The political will does not correspond to the scale of the problem at all. In any, and the other, the alternative is husband and wife somehow balancing, or wife staying at home, or even potentially husband staying at home to look after the children. I mean, there are only a limited number of options on the table to deal with this problematic. Who ends up looking after the kids? If you can't afford it, then you have to do it yourselves.
So precisely, I mean,
and
in the UK,
the nuclear family, of course, and you kind of atomization of family life. You may not have those extended family networks who could have helped bring up your child in previous generations.
So in the UK, it's particularly bad because, I mean, this is a discussion I've had with plenty of colleagues as well, where, I mean, the best option really for my wife is to be a stay-at-home mum as long as we've got young children, because any money she makes, she will pay that and more for childcare, so to speak. And so basically she would pay that and I would pay for childcare as well. So I mean, but at the same time, let me just mention one sort of interesting anecdote I came across just last month, actually, with a colleague who studied in Malaysia, his Bosnian colleague, Emin Sinanovic. And he was basically saying that when he was in Bosnia at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, they had a system where women who are students could have children, and they'd have extremely sort of like low cost childcare, and they would be given all sorts of provisions to allow them to have children. And so you'd have people who are PhD students with 3 or 4 kids, and both parents might be students, and they do end up becoming successful sort of scholars in that sort of institution in the longer term. And the thing is, if there is it's perfectly possible, in my view, to create environments where it's possible for women to be sort of economically productive and at the same time engage in the space of raising children. I mean, one thing I would say, and I don't want to...
But of course, it requires institutional framework, which requires some massive investment of resources. And if it's not the state, it has to be effective. It has to be some big institution, really. I mean,
right. I mean, the other thing I would say is that the economic productivity dimension. I mean, equality legislation. One of the things it did was removed the obligation of men to support their wives, and this is something which Marion, I think in the conclusion does highlight that there are women who are saying, no, I don't want to be deprived of that right that I have from Islamic law that obligates my husband to pay for my financial needs. Remind me, I may be misremembering, but I think she does mention that that option being available to women is something which I think a lot of there are costs and there are benefits to adopting this kind of equality.
I mean, I don't recall her saying that explicitly, but certainly I know from experience it's true. I did conduct a straw poll among some friends, Muslim and non-Muslim, prior to this episode, asking them about what they think is fair and what they think is equitable.
Right.
before, of course, a female friend who's much more sensible than me, of course, began by reminding me that this kind of fiqhi contractual approach to marriage is not anywhere reflected in real life, in the sense that in practice, women are, if they're not contributing financially, certainly they're offering their domestic labor. I mean, that's in the Muslim majority world, that's a given whether they work or not.
Right. But I mean, society wouldn't function otherwise. That's also part of the challenge here, isn't it? I
yeah,
mean,
this in some sense, that's recognized by these pre-modern jurists Marion discusses, whether it's Ibn Qudamah saying how domestic labor is conducive to the good order of the household, or
right.
Sarakhsi saying she's ethical, religiously obliged to do so. I mean, at one point, towards the beginning of the book, Katz, Marion refers to Ingrid Matsson's really interesting PhD dissertation, which was never published, which is a great shame. And Mattson says, you can never say, someone always has to do this labor, and if it's not the wife, it's going to be a slave or servant.
Yeah.
It's going to be someone, whether it's paid or unpaid.
An immigrant in the case of the West.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So you have this curious case of among elites, the proud feminists, but the childcare is done by a migrant laborer from the third world.
We're all complicit in this. I mean, in the global system, of course, the fact that you and I can engage in this kind of communication, or we have all of these immunities around us, these are built, by people who are, in many respects, slave labor in sort of not slaves in any legal sense, but in a very real way, we are externalizing. These are externalities to our.
I mean, one should at least attempt to exempt and extricate oneself from these problematic networks of dependency to the extent that one is able. So, as an unmarried man with no children, I'm not I'm not dependent on a wife's domestic labor, and I certainly clean my own room and make my own bed.
Right.
And one thing I would always say to the students in that gender and ethics course was, whether you're a man or you're a woman or what have you, I mean, you should learn to take care of yourself, because you should be able to depend on your own resources and capacities. And following Sarakhsi, or riffing off Sarakhsi, dependence is in some sense degrading. Going on from the Zuhd texts, Katz says you do get at least a hint of the sense that this kind of dependency on others makes one's own ubudiyya, or servanthood to God, imperfect. So you find, for example, not something she mentions, but certain Sahaba like Abu Bakr, who presumably also had slaves, and at least at some points in his life was known to cultivate this virtue of, or was reported to have, not asked people for anything, even if it's to pick up the reins of his riding animal that he dropped, he would do so himself, and not asking anything that you can do yourself. Do yourself and don't ask others to do for you. Of course, we are dependent on others; that's inescapable. Right. But from an ethical, legal point of view, or even a Sufi, or the point of view of a Zahid, one can say that, and is recognized by people like Sarakhsi. It's better not. Well, maybe not so much as Sarakhsi, but if you can avoid asking, that's better. That's better.
That sensibility is there in the Zuhd literature.
But also by asking others for their service, you're also entangling yourself in a complex web of mutual responsibilities.
Right.
So if someone does a favor for you, you're kind of obligated to return the favor. If someone gets you a gift, if someone gets you a really valuable gift, you might even be annoyed because socially you have to, and you should reciprocate. So that can be complicated sometimes.
But perhaps, I need to actually wrap up because I have a meeting shortly. But one of the, and it's very late where you are as well. One of the points on which, perhaps I can give a concluding reflection, and I'd like to hear. I mean, if you want to sort of share a thought on something else, please feel free. But I think one of the services that Marion's work has done is to illustrate that there is a great deal of variety that's possible within the tradition, and that modern people have, in many respects, been innovative in what they've come up with, and we can refashion these sorts of things in ways that remain faithful to the tradition, but also speak to our own sort of ethico-legal sensibilities. And I think that's an extremely important enterprise that, she doesn't engage in. She's not really a participant in this religious tradition per se, but she's really done a huge amount of groundwork that allows for people who want to do that seriously to undertake it.
Yeah. So that's a brilliant point. And again, thank you so much to Marion, not just for this book, but previous ones as well. I'm always reminded of this remark of Fazl Rahman, which is that, of course, he understood very keenly the challenges presented by modernity in the modern condition to Muslims. He always emphasized that, that project, or the enormous task of responding to those challenges, really begins with the intellectual spadework of excavating the tradition. And this is why he was such an interesting kind of interlocutor of the tradition. And Marion Katz's book is, without any kind of condescension, while taking very seriously the kinds of dilemmas confronted by her largely pre-modern interlocutors and sources, she does the intellectual spadework, for us, if you like. And the possibilities that one can build on are, almost infinite. But I'm reminded also of Hamid Fikri Ibrahim's book on child custody, where he also mentions this view of Ibn al-Qayyim, which is, hopefully not to oversimplify, but that as far as child custody is concerned, Ibn al-Qayyim says there are basically no or very few nusus, and it's really a matter of, to put it anachronistically, best interest of the child, which basically actually corresponds to the modern, human rights doctrine, and not actually to the norms enforced in the Muslim majority world, which tend to favor women and allocation of child custody, as he interestingly explores. But in any case, that's just, and of course, I'm not saying that Muslims must simply guard and adopt whatever happens to correspond to Euro-American norms on a particular subject. Euro-American norms, of course, themselves are complicated and contested, and you mentioned Jordan Peterson, so it's not like Westerners have any, have reached any ijma among themselves on these issues, and the culture wars continue to rage around us. But tradition is a very rich resource and toolbox, and one can spend many lifetimes kind of exploring that richness. And Katz does it.
I mean, on the Euro-American side of the equation, as I often tell sort of like colleagues and people outside the academy, that, look, if you go into sort of any humanities division in a university, the traditions are so very often like different traditions of ethical reflection or amoral reflection in some instances are so alienated from each other, they can't stand each other, or they cannot converse in sort of commensurable conversations. And I'm just thinking, like, obviously postmodernism and positivism and liberalism versus Foucault or whoever, Nietzsche. And so it's all traditions grapple with these issues. And I think I take pride in the fact that the Islamic tradition has a remarkable coherence to it, even though, I mean, Marion's just focused on the Sunni tradition here, and go a lot broader than that. But this, or just within Sunnism, you see so much diversity and so much richness, and that's not something which is a bad thing, but that's actually something very deeply enriching. And someone might turn around and tell me, well, your portrayal of the Western tradition shows it as fragmentary, but I consider it to be rich. So I'm not sort of like breaking this.
So of course it is kind of coherent, but it's also very diverse and full of contradiction as well, the Islamic tradition. But yeah, so I'd like to, end by reiterating our gratitude and thanks to Marion for this wonderful book.
Absolutely.
And for suggesting that anyone contemplating marriage, male or female, should read it. I think it's provides a lot of food for thought.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank Marion for really a wonderful book and really a thought-provoking piece of work, which is going to, I think, really ought to be read well outside the academy.
Oh yeah.
Muslims.
I mean, I know her previous book, Women in the Mosque, was definitely read outside the academy by Muslims, and if anything, this book is of even deeper relevance and pertinence.
Right. And I'd also like to thank you, Omar, for taking the time to very carefully read it. Reading through all the footnotes as you usually do, and offering a wonderful summary, but also a wonderful opportunity to discuss and take questions. And thank you to the viewers who've stuck with us for more than 2 hours at this point discussing the book. But with that, I guess, Omar, maybe you can briefly introduce next week's book.
Yes. Sergi Adak's book on anti-veiling campaigns in Turkey, specifically in the early Turkish Republic. This book we'll be looking at next week, inshallah, explores these kinds of early debates and state interventions in the mid-20th century, not entirely removed from today's book in the sense that it's also concerned with gender and gender ideals and debates of staticity and the involvement of the state, but of course focused on the modern period.
Right. Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. Really looking forward to seeing you in a week's time and sort of discussing that book as well. We just want to remind everyone that we'll be here on a regular basis every week at the same time, same place. So until then, please keep us in your du'as, and also, of course, Hajjun Mabrur wa Sa'yun Mashkur, inshallah, for Omar. You've lost all your hair in the sort of plains of Mina, I'm guessing. So, inshallah, we'll look forward to seeing everyone in a week's time. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.